fold, proving that even with Thank you for joining us for today's study. But I have a quick question before we get started. Have you ever felt like God's promises weren't happening fast enough in your life? I don't know about you, but I know I have. Type waiting in the comments if you know that feeling. You see, in Genesis 23, we meet Abraham at exactly that moment. God had promised him the entire land of Canaan. But here he was, not owning a single square foot of it. And now he needed to bury his wife, Sarah. I mean, come on. Talk about a test of faith. But here's what makes today's study so relevant for us. We're going to see how Abraham handled that pressure point, that moment when grief collided with God's promise. And I believe that someone watching right now needs to hear this exact message. So as we go through this powerful chapter, I want you to think about where you are in your journey of faith. Are you waiting on God's promises? Are you facing decisions that require bold faith? Share your situation in the comments because this community is here to pray with you. So, let's dive deeper into this powerful moment in Abraham's story and its historical value. All right, so now let's set the scene. Sarah has died and Abraham is faced with a critical moment. He's grieving, but he also knows he needs to act. He doesn't yet own any of the land that God had promised him and his descendants. So what does he do? He steps into action and makes the first legal land purchase recorded in Scripture. This wasn't just about buying a cave. Nah. Abraham secured the entire field, including all the trees within its borders. The boundaries were just clear. I mean, crystal clear. Now, the payment, 400 shekels of silver, this was agreed upon, and the whole transaction was done publicly with witnesses present. Abraham didn't leave any room for dispute, not whatsoever. This wasn't just a deal. It was a declaration of permanence. Now, let's talk about this payment. The 400 shekels of silver that Abraham paid. Now, back then, this wasn't just some little small sum. This represented significant purchase power, enough to buy substantial land, to buy substantial livestock, or even slaves. Now, in modern times, based on the current price of silver, that amount is equivalent to approximately about $4,576 in some change in 2025. Now, this detail reminds us that Abraham's purchase was both meaningful and costly. His willingness to pay full price rather than accept the land as a gift. Let me tell you something. This underscores his integrity and his desire to ensure the land's ownership was just indisputable. Now let's talk about the Hittites. These were influential people in Canaan, yet they saw Abraham, a foreigner, as a mighty prince. Now that title wasn't just a compliment. It was a recognition of God's favor on his life. Abraham negotiated respectfully, acknowledging his status as a foreigner while ensuring the deal was conducted with integrity. Don't miss that, integrity. And don't miss the cultural significance of what's going on here. So, burial customs in the ancient world symbolize permanence. Now, by securing Sarah's burial site in Canaan, Abraham wasn't just honoring his wife. He was tying his family's future to the land of God's promise. Tying his family's future to the land of God's promise. Even the location matters. Hebron, also known as Kiriath Arba, was a significant urban center during Abraham's time. Now, this was confirmed by archaeological evidence. The biblical account stands on solid historical ground. So Abraham's actions didn't just meet a personal need. Mm-mm. His actions set the stage for God's covenant promises to just unfold, proving that even in the midst of grief, faith takes tangible steps forward. Now, let's look at the key events and the significance of this chapter. Genesis 23 isn't just a record of events. Mm-mm. It's a story of faith in motion. Abraham's actions in this chapter aren't about convenience. They're about conviction, legacy, and trusting God's promises, even in the face of loss. So there are three things that I want you to take note of here in this particular section. Number one, Sarah's death marks a transition. At 127 years old, oh man, that's old. Sarah is the only woman in scripture whose age at death is recorded. Now, that's not an accident. It's a statement of her significance. Sarah wasn't just Abraham's wife. She was a key part of God's covenant plan. But Sarah's death wasn't just a statistic. It was deeply personal. Genesis 23:2 says, Abraham mourned and wept for her. This wasn't a quiet, reserved sorrow. This was raw, unfiltered grief. Yet, even in his mourning, Abraham knew he couldn't stay there. He transitioned from grief to action. Sarah's death pushed Abraham to secure the first piece of the promised land. So, what looked like a practical burial was actually a prophetic move towards God's covenant promises. Now, here's the second thing to take note of: the negotiation with the Hittites. Abraham approached the Hittites and he called himself a foreigner and a stranger. Yet, they didn't see him that way. They called him a prince of God. Oh man, think about that. Think about that. Abraham wasn't a local, but his character and God's favor on his life commanded respect. The negotiation wasn't just a handshake. Abraham made sure the deal was public. He made sure that it was transparent and legally binding. And with Ephraim, when he offered the land as a gift, you know what Abraham did? He refused. But why? Why did he refuse? Because shortcuts aren't faith. It's not faith's way. Shortcuts aren't faith's way. Abraham insisted on paying the full-blown price, 400 shekels of silver, to ensure there would be no question at all about the ownership. See, he wasn't just buying land. He was securing the future. Now, here's the third thing to take note of: the establishment of a family legacy. Now, the cave of Machpelah wasn't just Sarah's burial place. It became the foundation of a family legacy. Abraham, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Leah will all be buried there. This wasn't just a tomb. It was a physical declaration of God's promise. Every time someone passed that land, it was a reminder. This is the start of something way bigger. So Abraham didn't just bury Sarah. He anchored his family's future to the promised land. Symbolizing God's faithfulness in the unfolding of his covenant. Now the question is, how does all of this affect us today. This chapter isn't just a story about a man buying a burial plot. Nah, it's a masterclass in living a life of faith, living a life of integrity and legacy. You see, Abraham's actions shows us what it looks like to step out when God's promises feel so distant, to do things the right way when the easy way is available, and to build something that outlives us. So I want to give you 3 nuggets on how this chapter affects us today. Number 1, faith requires action. You see, when Sarah died, Abraham didn't just sit back and wait for God to drop the land in his lap. He didn't throw up his hands and say, well, you know what? I guess it's not my time. It must not be my time right now. Instead, he moved. He bought the cave of Machpelah, stepping into the land that God had promised him. You see, faith is like a muscle. Yeah. It's not just something you believe, it's something that you use. James 2:17 tells us that faith without works is what? Dead. If you say you trust God, but you're standing still, baby, that's not faith. Because faith moves. Abraham made a tangible investment in the future God had promised, even when he didn't see it fully. And you know what we do? You know what we do? We got to see it to believe it. So the question is, what's your next move? God may have already spoken, but are you acting on what he said? Don't wait. Don't wait. Don't wait for perfect conditions. Step out in faith and watch God meet you there. You know what? Take a moment right now and share in the comments, what action is God calling you to take in faith right now? What is he calling you to do? Drop it in the comments right now. Okay, now here's the second nugget. Integrity in our actions. Now, when the Hittites offered Abraham the land for free, he could have taken the easy way out. But Abraham knew something. Shortcuts often lead to dead ends. So he insisted paying the full price, ensuring that the transaction was honorable and unquestionable. In today's world, people love shortcuts. They want success without sacrifice. They want recognition without responsibility. But Proverbs 11:3 reminds us, the integrity of the upright guides them. So Abraham's decision, it shows us that how you do something really matters to God. He's not just looking at the outcome. God's watching the process. So the question is this: where are you tempted to cut corners? Just choose integrity. Even when it costs you more, God honors those who do things his way. Now, here's the third nugget. Building a legacy. The cave of Machpelah wasn't just for Sarah. It became the burial site for Abraham, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, Leah. This wasn't just a tomb, it was a down payment on God's promises. You see, Abraham anchored his family's future to the land God promised him. Legacy isn't just about what you leave behind. It's about what you set in motion. Proverbs 13:22 says, a good person leaves an inheritance for his children's children. You see, your faith, integrity, and obedience today, it actually shapes the future for those who come after you. You see, Abraham, he didn't just think about his moment. He made decisions that pointed generations to God. So, what are you building that will outlast you? Are you investing in something eternal? Or are you focused on the here and now? Genesis 23 calls us to action right now. Abraham's story reminds us to move in faith, live with integrity, and build a legacy that reflects God's promises. So the question is this: will you make the kind of decisions today that your children's children will thank you for tomorrow? This chapter is a blueprint for living a life that counts. Abraham didn't wait for the perfect circumstances. He stepped out in faith, secured God's promise, and left a legacy that still speaks today. So what about you? Are you acting in faith? Are you living with integrity? Are you building for the future? God's promises require participation. So step boldly into what he's calling you to do right now. Honor him with your actions and leave a mark that points generations back to him. Before we dive into Genesis 24, I want you to take a moment and drop a comment in the chat with one of the biggest decisions that you're facing right now. It could be about how to adjust your budget with the rising costs of everything, or how to handle charitable giving in your retirement, your career, your relationships, how to simplify just daily routines, or even your faith walk. Now, why is this important? Because today's story about finding Isaac's wife isn't just ancient history. It's actually going to show us exactly how to navigate those life-changing decisions with God's guidance. And while you're typing that in the comment, let me ask you something. Have you ever made a decision that completely changed the entire direction of your life? Maybe it was saying yes to a job, moving to a new city, or choosing to follow God. That's exactly what we're going to explore today. And I want to hear your stories in the comments because your experiences, they really matter. And they might just encourage someone who's watching right now. You know, have you ever realized that one decision, just one, could be the turning point that changes your life forever? You know, in this chapter, we see how one choice not only shaped Isaac's future, but secured God's covenant promise for many generations. So this isn't just about the past. And a lot of times that's how people like to read the book of Genesis. Oh, that's just ancient history. That's old. That's back in, those days. No, it's actually a reminder for today because your choices matter. In this teaching, we're going to unpack several things. Number one, we're going to look at the historical value of Genesis 24 and its cultural backdrop. Number two, we're going to look at the key moments where faith and action actually intersect with God's providence. And number three, we're going to look at how this chapter equips us to face today's decisions. Not yesterday, but today's decisions with bold, faith-filled confidence. Let's dive in. All right, so let's look at the historical value. And there are three things that I need to point out concerning it. First is the cultural context. Now, marriage during Abraham's time wasn't just personal. It was actually strategic, strengthening family alliances and ensuring tribal loyalty. So finding a wife for Isaac from his own people wasn't just about tradition. It was about preserving the covenantal identity and the inheritance that God had promised Abraham. But alliances and legacies were not only priorities. The way these decisions were made carried just as much weight, involving significant rituals as well as customs. Second is the daily practices and beliefs. Now, when Abraham's servant swore an oath by placing his hands under Abraham's thigh, now this is in verses 2 through 9, it symbolized absolute loyalty and accountability before God. These oaths were binding and reflecting the seriousness of the mission. Now, when we look at the meeting at the well, this just adds another added layer. Wells weren't just water sources, they were community hubs for connection as well as decision making. So, the servant's encounter with Rebekah shows how God works through ordinary settings to fulfill his purposes. These customs and rituals were part of a larger mission, preserving Abraham's covenant with God. Third is the kingship and covenant preservation. Now, understand that Abraham's directive to find Isaac's wife from his kin emphasized protecting their covenantal identity. Marrying outside the lineage, especially among the Canaanites, risked introducing beliefs that could actually compromise their faith. So, by choosing a wife who shared their values, Abraham ensured the integrity of God's promise to his descendants. Now, we must understand that kingship wasn't just about traditions. It safeguarded their faith, it safeguarded their values, as well as their wealth. So avoiding intermarriage with the Canaanites, and this we see in verse 3, aligned with the broader regional practices, ensuring that God's promise stayed central to the family's legacy. Now that we understand the cultural framework that shaped these decisions, let's examine the key moments where these principles came to life through Abraham's faithful actions. And there are 4 that I want to point out to you. So the first one is Abraham's charge to his servants. Now, when Abraham instructed his servant to find a wife for Isaac, he wasn't simply concerned with Isaac's marital happiness. He was focused on God's covenant. Abraham's command to avoid Canaanite women, and we find this in verses 3 through 4, it wasn't about cultural prejudice, but about spiritual preservation. The Canaanites were just, let me tell you something, these people were just head over heels in idolatry. And Abraham understood that marrying outside the faith would endanger the covenant God had established through him. So this wasn't, it wasn't about convenience. It was about conviction. Abraham's insistence on finding a wife from his own kin, it ensured that Isaac's lineage would remain rooted in faith, aligning with God's plan. Now, here's the second point. The servant's prayer and encounter at the well. We find this in verses 10 through 27. As the servant approached the well, he prayed a bold, specific prayer that the woman who offered him water and also drew water for his camels would be the one who God had chosen for Isaac. This wasn't just, some practical request. It reflected his trust in God's providence. You see, when Rebekah offered water and went further to draw water for 10 camels, her actions revealed her character. Her actions revealed her generosity, her diligence, and not only that, her readiness to serve. Her response was the answer to the servant's prayer, confirming that God was orchestrating this whole encounter. Here's the third thing here. Rebekah's family's consent. We find this in verses 28 through 60. When the servant met Rebekah's family, he retold the story of how God led him to her. His testimony wasn't just a recap. Nah, not at all. It was a declaration of God's sovereignty and his provision. Laban and Bethuel recognized that this wasn't just a marriage proposal. It was actually a divine appointment. So Rebecca's willingness to leave immediately mirrored Abraham's faith when God called him to leave his homeland. The servant presented all of these lavish gifts to Rebecca and her family, symbolizing the union's covenantal significance. So now here's the fourth thing: Isaac and Rebecca's marriage. As Rebecca approached Isaac, she veiled herself. Now, this was a sign of humility and readiness to embrace her new role. Isaac received her as his wife and was comforted after his mother's death. So this marriage wasn't just about two people. It was actually about the continuation of God's covenant. Isaac trusted his father's wisdom. Rebecca trusted God's call. And together, they stepped into a partnership that carried God's promises forward. Having witnessed how each character's faithful decisions came together to fulfill God's plan, now let's explore how their example can transform our own decision making today. If Genesis 24 teaches us anything, it's that the choices that we make today ripple far beyond the moment. Every decision is a seed that grows into tomorrow's harvest, shaping not just your life, but the lives of those who follow. So the question is this: how do we honor God in those decisions? Let's look at 5 ways this chapter challenges us to live faithfully today. Number 1, we must seek God's guidance in every decision, not some decisions, because sometimes we want to seek him in just some things, but we need to seek him in every decision. And one of the most striking moments in this chapter is the servant's prayer for direction. He didn't just leave things to chance. He prayed specifically and trusted God to answer specifically. This wasn't a vague, half-hearted plea. It was focused. It was a focused, faith-filled act of dependence. How often do we approach our decisions with that level of trust? Think about that. How often do we do that? Whether you're choosing a career, navigating family challenges, or deciding on a life partner, invite God into every decision. Not just some decisions, because God is not a backup plan. He needs to be the main plan. You know, we live in a world that is just so obsessed with quick solutions. We need to avoid the temptation to rush ahead without seeking God's wisdom. Prayer isn't just preparation, it's partnership with the one who sees the whole picture. Now, once we start seeing God's guidance, the second step is to ensure that our relationships align with his standards. Abraham didn't settle for what was easy or convenient. When seeking a wife for Isaac, what he did was prioritize faith and values over proximity or cultural trends. You know, relationships, whether romantic, friendships, or even business, these things shouldn't pull us away from God, but it should draw us closer to him. So we need to build connections rooted in shared values and commitment to righteousness. So one of the things that we need to do is take inventory of our relationships. Are they encouraging our walk with God? Or are they leading us towards compromise? Now, let's focus on the third critical issue, and that is that we must trust God's timing. Let me say that again. We must trust God's timing. Isaac's marriage didn't just happen through manipulation or impatience. The servant's journey took time, and the process wasn't rushed. But when God's hand was at work, if you notice, everything fell into place exactly at the right moment. In our fast paced culture, waiting on God's timing is one of the hardest lessons to learn, but it's also one of the most rewarding. I know that waiting on God is hard. Trust me. I know that waiting on God is hard, especially when the culture pressures you to act right now. That's just the society that we live in. Constant pressure. Trust that his timing is better than any shortcut you can actually take. Ask yourself this. Am I pushing my own agenda, or am I trusting God's timeline? Listen, let go. Just let go of impatience before it leads you into unnecessary pain. Because a lot of times we cause pain on ourselves because we rushed God's timeline. Now, while we wait on God's timing, the fourth point is that we need to remember the importance of taking action in faith. Well, what does that mean? What does that actually mean to take action in faith? The servant didn't just pray and hope for results. He prepared for the journey, carried gifts, and actively sought confirmation. Faith without action is empty. But when faith and works align, God's plans unfold in ways we couldn't even imagine. So, if you're praying for a breakthrough, take steps that align with your prayers. Whether it's sending out resume, you know what? Speaking of sending out resumes, people say, I need a job. I need a job. But these people, they won't even send out a single resume. They won't even fill out a single application, yet they're looking for a job. So you got to take action. So whether sending out resumes, initiating reconciliation, or taking steps to improve your health, or making financial changes to get out of debt, act in faith and let God guide your steps. What's one practical step you can take today to act on what you've been praying for all along? Don't just wait. Move in faith. And finally, we come to the ultimate challenge in this passage, which is the fifth point. And that is how we build a lasting legacy of faith. Abraham's actions weren't about short-term gains. They were about ensuring God's covenant promises would endure for generations. His decision set the foundation for Isaac's faith journey and ultimately for the nation of Israel. So every decision you make is a building block for the legacy you leave. Think beyond today and consider how your choices impact future generations, your children, your community, and your church. Ask yourself this question. Am I living for eternity? Or am I stuck in the temporary? Make decisions that reflect a bigger picture that's rooted in God's promises. So this chapter, it challenges us to trust God in every detail of our lives, from the small decisions to the life-changing decisions. It's a reminder that faith isn't passive. It's active. It's courageous. And always forward looking. What seeds are you planting today that will bear fruit for generations to come? Have you ever thought about how one decision today could ripple across your family for generations? That is the weight Genesis 25 lays on us. Every choice has consequences, not just for now, but for what echoes into the future. So this chapter isn't just some ancient family tree. It's actually God's reminder that his promises stand firm, but our choices determine how those promises unfold in our lives. You see, Jacob Esau's story shows us how one decision, just one decision, can either secure God's blessings or squander them. This account isn't just about names and events. It's actually, I would say it's actually a divine mirror reflecting the kind of legacy you're building with your choices right here, right now. What you do today, it doesn't stop with you. It just keeps going. It just keeps going. Shaping the future for your children, your grandchildren, and beyond. So this biblical record calls us to pay close attention on three levels. The first is that we'll dig into the historical value, and here we'll be looking at how God's promises stretched across generations and actually shaped the nations. And then secondly, we examine the key events and their significance. And here we'll be looking at the moments where decisions turn the tide of history, like Isaac's inheritance, Esau's impulsive trade, and Jacob's ambition. And then finally, we'll bring it all home by looking at how this chapter affects us today, asking the hard questions about the choices that we make and the legacies that we're leaving behind. So, ready or not, let's dive in. All right, so let's look at the historical value here. When God promised to make Abraham a father of nations, he didn't just mean his lifetime. He meant nations that would just shape history. So that promise was bigger than Abraham. And its impact is still being felt today. We see God's faithfulness most clearly in how he fulfilled his promise through Abraham's family line, which is my first point. Abraham's expanding lineage. When Genesis 25 opens, we see a God who doesn't leave promises half finished. That's something that we do. We do that. We half do stuff. But God, he doesn't half do anything. And after Sarah's death, Abraham kept going. He married what's her name? Keturah. And had 6 more sons, and we see this in Genesis 1-4, who became ancestors of Arabian tribes, spreading God's promise beyond one family. So God wasn't just working through Isaac. He was working through every branch of Abraham's family tree, showing that his promises always expand. And don't miss that. Don't miss that. His promises, they always expand because God didn't forget Ishmael. Verses 12-18 tells us Ishmael had 12 sons and they became tribal leaders, just as God promised Hagar in Genesis chapter 16. So every name in this lineage screams one truth, and that is God is faithful. Ooh. Type that in the chat right now. Go down in the comments and type that in the chat. God is faithful. If you hear what I'm saying, type God is faithful. He is faithful. See, Abraham's lineage didn't just fulfill promises. It shaped the geopolitical landscape of the ancient world, which brings us to the second point, geopolitical significance. Abraham's descendants didn't just grow in number. Man, they shaped the world. Ishmael's tribe settled from Havilah to Shur, covering trade routes, connecting to the trade routes. They connected to Egypt to Assyria. And so Keturah's sons They spread across the regions that would later play key roles in history. These aren't just names. They are markers of how God takes one man's obedience, and turns it into nations that influence the globe. Did you hear what I just said? You see, this isn't just about Abraham. It's about a God whose promises don't expire. You see, when you go to Walmart and you can get things off the shelf, take it home just to discover that the thing that you just bought just expired. It expired. But the thing is about God's promises, his promises don't expire. What he said to Abraham shaped the tribes, it shaped territories and legacies, impacting the political and cultural landscape of the ancient Near East. So, the key point is that God's promises are never limited by time or circumstances. His word doesn't stop in one generation. It stretches into the future, shaping the history and transforming lives. And that same God who fulfilled his promises to Abraham is still working to fulfill his promises through you today. Yeah, I'm talking to you. You. Let's look at the four key events. God works through ordinary moments to create extraordinary outcomes. This chapter shows how divine sovereignty and human choices shape the course of history. So the first key moment is Abraham's death and Isaac's inheritance. This is where God promises passes to the next generation. So Abraham, he didn't just leave Isaac his wealth. He left him the responsibility of carrying God's covenant forward. That inheritance wasn't about gold. It wasn't about silver. It was about legacy. You see, Isaac was the link in the chain of God's promises. Abraham's burial in the cave was Machpelah. Alongside Sarah was a marker of God's faithfulness. And that land, it wasn't just dirt. It was actually evidence that God keeps his word. Every single detail from it, and if you really pay attention to this, every single detail from Isaac's inheritance to the burial site, it actually pointed to a fulfilled promise and a secured future. Now, the second moment is the genealogy of Ishmael. So, when God spoke to Hagar in the wilderness, he didn't just comfort her. He gave her a promise. Genesis 25 shows that he delivered. God delivers, he delivers on his promises. Ishmael's 12 sons became leaders of nations, settling in lands critical to the world's power structure, and even outside the covenant. God's faithfulness, it just overflowed. So what does that tell us? When God speaks, baby, he provides. He provides. Whether you're part of the chosen line or seeing his grace from the outside, God provides. Here's the third moment. Here's the third key moment. And it's the birth of Jacob and Esau. And we see this in verses 19 through 26. So here it is. Isaac and Rebekah's story could have ended in barrenness. But what happened was Isaac prayed and God answered. God didn't just give them children. He gave them nations just wrestling in the womb. They just wrestling. So his declaration that the older would serve the younger turned cultural norms upside down. Oh man, here we go. So when that happened, when things got turned upside down, it showed that his plans don't depend on human expectations. You see, Jacob and Esau's birth wasn't just a family moment. It was a start of a divine story of tension and triumph that shaped history. So the fourth key moment is Esau trading his birthright. Now, I gotta say, Esau, oh Lord help me right now, Esau didn't lose his birthright in a crisis. This fool gave it away in comfort. His hunger wasn't just physical, it revealed his disregard, his blatant disregard for what truly mattered. Now, Jacob, oh my goodness, Jacob, though cunning, he valued what Esau dismissed. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Esau was basically that guy who trades his Tesla for a cheeseburger because the drive-through line was just too long at McDonald's. Just silly. That bowl of stew wasn't just a meal, it was a defining moment. Esau traded something priceless for what wouldn't last. How many of us do the same thing? And when you do that, it reveals how chasing temporary pleasures comes at the expense of what truly matters. So here's the key point. What looks ordinary, a burial, a prayer we lift up to God, a meal, it can carry immense significance in God's hands. So Genesis 25 isn't just about history. We need to pay attention because it challenges us to reflect on our choices today. So let me ask you something. Are your decisions aligning with God's plans? Or are you trading his promises for short-term relief? Remember, what you do today, it will shape the future. You see, Esau's decision to trade what mattered most for what mattered in the moment is a clear warning for us today, leading us to how Genesis 25 affects us right now. So I want to give you 3 ways how this chapter affects us today. The first is decisions have lasting consequences. Esau didn't just lose his birthright. The boy gave it away. He traded something eternal for a moment of satisfaction. That bowl of stew didn't just fill his stomach, it emptied his future just like an empty bank account. He chose what was easy over what was essential, what was temporary over what was eternal. And that decision, it didn't just define his legacy, it shaped the destiny of nations. So what about you? Are you facing your own bowl of stew moments? Or are you choosing comfort over calling? Are you choosing convenience over conviction? Maybe it's a shortcut in your finances. Maybe it's compromising your values for a paycheck. Or maybe it's neglecting your time with God for something that feels urgent but won't last. Let me tell you, what you trade for convenience today may cost you a blessing tomorrow. Don't let a temporary craving rob you of an eternal promise. Well, let me move on. Here's the second way this chapter affects us. Family legacy shapes the future. The tension between Jacob and Esau, it didn't just come out of nowhere. This thing was cultivated in a divided home. Isaac favored Esau, Rebekah favored Jacob, and the seeds of favoritism just grew. It grew into a harvest of divisions. And you know, as parents, we need to avoid showing favoritism to our kids. Why? Because it can divide the home. You see, their choices didn't just affect their sons. It echoed through the generations. The rivalry between the Israelites and the Edomites, it began in that household. So how are you shaping the legacy of your family? Just think about that for a moment. How are you shaping the legacy of your family? Are you sowing seeds of unity or division? Maybe just maybe you're not showing favoritism, but are you overlooking moments to build a foundation of faith in your home? Because families today are still suffering from unresolved conflicts and poor communication. Let me tell you something. What happens in your house doesn't stay in your house. Even though we may think it does, it doesn't. Let me tell you why. It multiplies in the lives of your children and their children. And the question is, are you building a family that honors God, or are you allowing division to grow? Here's the third way this chapter affects us. God's sovereignty prevails. Even with all the mistakes in Genesis 25, God's plan wasn't stopped. Now, Jacob wasn't perfect, but he became the carrier of the covenant. Esau's choices didn't derail God's purpose. So the dysfunction in Isaac's family did not cancel God's promises. Why is that? Because God's sovereignty is bigger than human failure. What he declared, what he decrees, he delivers. So maybe you've made some mistakes. Maybe you made a lot of mistakes. Maybe you have chosen the wrong thing, or you're living with the consequences of a bad decision. But let me remind you, God is not finished with you yet. You see, your failures don't cancel his faithfulness. His sovereignty means that even in your weakness, oh man, I'm talking to myself right now. Even in your weakness, he can still use you for his glory. Trust him to take what's broken and make that thing beautiful. So here's the final charge that I want to leave you with before I close out this lesson. This chapter challenges us to make choices that align with God's plan, to build families that honor him, and to trust his sovereignty even when we fail. Your decisions matter. What you do today will echo into the future. But the good news is this. No matter how flawed your story might feel, God's purpose is still unfolding, and his promises never fail. So the question is this. Are you making choices that align with his eternal plan? Or are you trading away your birthright for a bowl of stew?